My name is Richard Thompson, and this is the story of a flight I will never forget. It was supposed to be a routine trip from New York to Los Angeles, but what transpired on that flight still haunts me to this day. It was July 15th, 2023, and our flight 935, was scheduled to depart at 10:30 p.m. I arrived at John F. Kennedy International Airport around 8:00 p.m., excited to visit my family in California. Little did I know, this trip would be a descent into terror. The boarding process was smooth. Passengers were a mix of business travelers, families, and a few solo adventurers like myself. I noticed a young couple, Jessica and Mark, sitting a few rows ahead of me. They looked happy and in love, ready for a vacation. Across the aisle from me was an elderly woman named Mrs. Wilson, who was nervously clutching her handbag. She told me she was visiting her grandchildren for the first time in years. In the back, a group of teenagers, probably on a school trip, were already laughing and joking loudly. Among them was a girl named Emily, who seemed particularly anxious. We took off on time, and the city lights below gradually faded as we ascended into the night sky. The cabin lights dimmed, and a calm settled over the passengers. The captain, Captain Miller, came on the intercom, reassuring us of a smooth flight and pleasant weather conditions. Little did we know, the real storm was about to begin. About an hour into the flight, around 11:30 p.m., strange things began to happen. It started with a flicker of the cabin lights, which most of us dismissed as minor turbulence. But then the flickering became more frequent, and an uneasy murmur spread among the passengers. Jessica, the young woman, called over a flight attendant named Lisa. She seemed as unsettled as the rest of us, but assured Jessica it was just a minor electrical issue. As we flew deeper into the night, the atmosphere inside the plane grew more tense. The air seemed to thicken, and a sense of unease crept over me. I tried to focus on the book I was reading, but my eyes kept darting around the cabin, scanning for any signs of trouble. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from the back of the plane. Emily, the anxious teenager, screamed, and everyone turned to see what had happened. Lisa rushed to the back to investigate, but she returned with a puzzled look on her face. "Nothing's wrong," she said, trying to sound convincing, but her voice betrayed her fear. The teenagers were now visibly shaken, and the laughter had turned to whispers. I glanced at Mrs. Wilson, who was now clutching a rosary and mumbling prayers under her breath. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, sounding strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we seem to be experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain calm and stay in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." His words did little to comfort us. At 12:15 a.m., the turbulence started. The plane shook violently, and the passengers clung to their seats. The overhead bins rattled, and a few items fell to the floor. Jessica and Mark held each other tightly, fear etched on their faces. The lights flickered more intensely, casting eerie shadows across the cabin. Then it happened. The lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness. Panic set in, and I could hear people shouting and crying. Suddenly, a dim emergency light flickered on, casting a ghostly glow. That's when we saw it. At the front of the cabin, near the cockpit door, a figure appeared. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was dressed in an old-fashioned pilot's uniform, but his face was pale and twisted, with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. "Who's there?" shouted Mark, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it moved slowly down the aisle, its footsteps echoing in the silence. As it passed each row, the air grew colder. Mrs. Wilson fainted, and Lisa tried to revive her, but her eyes kept darting back to the ghostly figure. The figure stopped in front of me, and I could feel its icy breath on my face. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. The lights flickered back on, and the plane seemed to stabilize, but the sense of dread remained. Captain Miller's voice came over the intercom again, but this time it was different. There was a strange echo, as if he was speaking from a great distance. "We're not alone," he said, his voice barely audible. "He's here with us." Passengers were now in full-blown panic mode. Jessica was crying and Mark was trying to comfort her. The teenagers huddled together, terrified. Lisa was frantically trying to reach the cockpit, but the door was locked. I could hear her banging on it, shouting for the captain, but there was no response. At 1 a.m., the plane started to descend rapidly. The cabin pressure dropped and oxygen masks deployed from the overhead compartments. I struggled to put mine on, my hands shaking. The plane was now in a nosedive, and I could hear the engines straining. People were screaming, and the ghostly figure reappeared, this time in the middle of the cabin. It raised its hand, and the descent slowed, but only slightly. The figure turned its hollow eyes towards Emily, the anxious teenager. She screamed, a blood-curdling sound that sent chills down my spine. The figure moved towards her, and in an instant, she was gone. Just vanished, as if she had never been there. The panic escalated, and I could see people trying to unbuckle their seatbelts, desperate to get away. At 1:15 a.m., the plane leveled out, but the terror was far from over. The ghostly figure was now in the cockpit, visible through the small window in the door. Captain Miller was slumped over the controls, his face pale and lifeless. Lisa managed to open the door and stumbled back, her face ashen. "He's dead," she whispered. "The captain is dead." The figure turned towards me again, and I knew we were doomed. But then I remembered something my grandmother used to tell me about spirits. "They feed on fear," she would say. "Show no fear, and they lose their power." Summoning every ounce of courage, I stood up and faced the ghostly figure. "Leave us alone," I shouted, my voice trembling but defiant. The figure seemed to hesitate, its hollow eyes narrowing. "You have no power here," I continued, taking a step forward. The air grew colder, and I could feel the fear trying to take hold, but I fought it with every fiber of my being. The figure let out a terrible wail, a sound that seemed to pierce my very soul. But then it began to fade, slowly at first, and then all at once. The lights flickered back on, and the plane stabilized. Captain Miller's body was still slumped over the controls, but the ghostly figure was gone. At 2 a.m., we made an emergency landing at a small airport in the middle of nowhere. Emergency personnel boarded the plane and we were escorted off, dazed and terrified. Jessica and Mark were holding each other, tears streaming down their faces. Mrs. Wilson was being carried off on a stretcher, still unconscious. The teenagers were huddled together, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. We were taken to a nearby hotel where we were questioned by authorities. I told them everything, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They didn't believe me, but I knew what I had seen. We all did. To this day, I don't know what happened on Flight 935. The official report attributed the incident to a sudden loss of cabin pressure and pilot error. But those of us who were there know the truth. Something was on that plane with us. Something evil. It's been months since that fateful night, but I still have nightmares. I see the ghostly figure in my dreams, its hollow eyes staring into mine. I can still hear Emily's scream, the sound echoing in my mind. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fly again, but I do know one thing. I will never forget Flight 935 and the terror that unfolded at 35,000 feet. The ghostly figure, the cold air, the screams of my fellow passengers, all of it is etched into my memory. And as much as I wish I could forget, I know that some things can never be forgotten. And that's the spine-chilling tale of Flight 935. If If this story sent shivers down your spine, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. You won't believe the terrifying tales we have in store. Each story will take you deeper into the unknown, where every shadow hides a secret and every whisper is a warning. Stay tuned, because the horrors are just beginning, and trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment. Are you brave enough to join us on this journey into the darkness? Subscribe now and find out.